Good morning, my YouTube friends and family. Hope everyone's doing well. I'm just starting my day. Trying to get out of this parking without taking anybody's fender off. Not so much in front, but on the tail end. Guy backed up in next to me pretty tight, and my tandems are slid all the way forward, so if you turn too tight, the tail swing can swing out and and pull a fender right off, or a bumper. But we avoided that crisis. We're good. Anyways, tonight I'll be going over the load board. I looked at it briefly, and there's a lot of markets that don't have much on it, but honestly I think today, during the day, their system is going to upload stuff for Monday, and so it'll hopefully look better tonight. We're just pulling out of this this truck stop in Virginia. I know it sounds impossible, but I said yesterday I got to make it to Texas. It's actually Arkansas where my first drop is. This load is 1 pick, 3 drops. And it's Monday morning when I got to be in Little Rock, and then from there I go south to Houston. I drop in Houston, and I believe dispatch found me a load heading to Odessa. So I'll drop in Odessa, and from there just deadhead about 80 miles to the yard. And then I'm gonna jump in a pickup truck. A pickup truck I'm giving to my daughter, by the way. I'm giving my daughter an F-150 that I was using for work. It's a 2019 F-150 crew cab, 4-wheel drive, blue jeans blue. It's just an XLT package. It's not all fancy. I mean, I bought it to go to the oil field, but you know, she likes pickup trucks. And she turned 16. We're throwing her a little party next week. It's not technically a Sweet 16. My daughter is, my wife is a Pacific Islander. And so my daughter's half Hispanic, half Pacific Islander, born and raised in the U.S. And, you know, we asked her years ago, you know, what are you going to want? Hispanic style quinceañera, an American style Sweet 16, or a Filipino style debut at the age of 18. And so we started taking her to several different parties so she could see them all, and she chose the debut at 18, which is cool. It gives me a little more time to save and get ready, right? No, and flat out, she said, "Dad, the quince looks stressful." She goes, it just looks like a wedding. She's all, I don't want all that. I'm not ready for all that. Sure, okay, whatever you want. And so this pickup truck is something that I don't use anymore. It's been literally parked at the yard for like the last year. When we bought it, we got a really good deal on it, and we put a large down payment on it, so the payment's really low, and it's just been sitting there doing nothing. She's gonna need a vehicle to start driving, and you know, these things with their 10-speed autos now, you know, if you drive them halfway conservatively, you know, they get 20 miles to the gallon. We live in a small town, so it's not like she'll be going very far. And so I'll be taking that to her. And I know I'm sharing a whole bunch about my personal life, but it's something that's happening in my life, and it's kind of why I'm taking these weird loads heading west. But I wanted to touch on a little bit the video from yesterday where I was talking about, what I would purchase. I have a couple friends that watch my channel, and I kind of use them as barometers of what's kind of a good topic and what's going to be looked at a little bit oddball, and am I sticking my foot in my mouth or whatever. And one of them said, man, you're making it look like I didn't buy a good truck. And I'm like, what do you mean? He goes, well, I have a hood truck with X gear ratios and this transmission, and I'm like, dude, but that fits your application. You run oversized and overweight, and so it makes sense for what you're doing. I'm talking to guys that are interested in Amazon, and he's like, well, your group is about trucking, it's not about Amazon. I'm like, yeah, but if you look at my analyticals, the videos that get the most views are the ones where I do the Amazon load board. And so obviously the majority of my subscribers and the majority of the people viewing my videos are interested in Amazon. And so your Amazon loads are very, very light. I'm not on an Amazon load now. I'm running some ventilation units to build those outdoor seating areas, right? And so these are like big fans. They're sealed, but you connect ventilation lines to them, and they're air movers. I guess that's a better way to put it. And so these things are light. My total weight here is like 6,000 pounds between all three units. And so this is typical of an Amazon style load, and you don't need 600 horse and an 18 speed to do this load. And so some of you guys aren't going to agree with my thoughts and ideas, but I'm kind of gearing my comments towards the guys that are going to run Amazon loads. And as I'm building up speed here, I just got on the freeway, and I don't accelerate real hard when I first get the truck running, because everything's not warm yet, even though the truck's been idling for a while. Your tranny fluid's not warm, your differential fluid's not warm, your engine oil, it's up to temperature, but it's not where it runs once you've been putting a load on it. But as I'm accelerating here, we're doing 60, and I'm turning 1200 RPM. And so if you had the wrong gear ratios, you'd be turning 1400 already, and by the time you get up to, let's say, 70, you're turning way too much RPM, and even though you're empty and not putting a lot of boost into it, you're still burning fuel you don't need to burn. I made the comment that for Amazon loads, you could even get away with an M11. An M11 is a smaller displacement engine. I think their horsepower rating peaked out at like 380, 390, and then people can hop them up a little bit. I know they can put different injectors in them, and there's some orifices they can change to allow more fuel to flow. There's a handful of things they can do, and they'll end up making like 430 horse, which again is more than enough for an Amazon load. And so if you guys check out Trucker Style Sean, he's running an older FLD 120. It's a 2-axle. In other words, it only has one drive axle. It's a day cab, and he recently bought that specifically to do Amazon loads. So he's running a 390 horse motor with a 10-speed and a day cab. The guy has contracted loads. In other words, he doesn't work the Amazon relay board for the spot market. You know, he has a contract where he's basically guaranteed his price per mile, and he just needs to pick the loads on his lane that he wants. He's got a handful of trucks, and he runs some owner-operators under his, and so this is what he's doing, and he's getting 10 miles to the gallon. So think about that for a minute. He's getting 10 miles to the gallon. A hood truck with 377 gears and, you know, a 500 horse big block, let's say a Cat or a Cummins, you know, those are getting 5. Don't let anybody fool you and tell you that with a 379 or a W900 they're getting 9. I'd like to see their IFTA report if they're saying they're getting 9, because I highly doubt it. Anyway, so Sean claims he's getting 10. Now 10 sounds a little hard to believe for some. It's a small motor. You know, he doesn't do really long hauls. I've not had experience in Florida, but I don't envision it's very mountainous. And so he probably gets a lot of really easy runs where, you know, he's just in 10th speed, putting along, getting great mileage. Now, again, some people probably aren't liking the fact that I'm not saying, oh yeah, get yourself a hood truck and, you know, get the big boy, you know, Cat or Cummins, but it doesn't fit the application of Amazon. Now, in my particular case, where I've moved away from Amazon and I'm doing loads through different brokers, if I had an M11 with 380 horse and a 10-speed, I probably wouldn't be liking some of the heavier loads where I'm grossing out, you know, 70, 75,000 pounds. Today's load is super duper light. As I'm looking down at the air pressure in my suspension, it reads 20. I got 20 PSI in my suspension, and the 3 pallets are butted all the way up against the front. In other words, my trailer's not carrying any weight. It's, for the most part, empty. And so today's load, an M11 would do it all day long. The load I just moved and delivered yesterday was food, and it was 43,000 pounds worth of payload. So yeah, I was tipping the scales at like 75, and yeah, the hills made me split gears and that kind of stuff. You need a little more oomph for a load like that. But if you guys are going to be focused on Amazon, again, the idea isn't how much money you gross, the idea is how much money you net. And so even someone like Sean, who has, you know, he has 3-axle trucks, and he has the bigger engines in some of his trucks. You know, even he decided to try, you know, a little 2-axle tractor with an M11. You know, he does run the risk of one day picking up a load that's a little too heavy for that truck, but for as much as he moves for them on a daily basis, he still decided to take that chance because he doesn't think it's going to happen to him. Either that or he knows there's not a whole lot of scales in the area he's running. I don't know. But that's just my opinion. And like I said, the truck I would get currently, it does include a little more power. I do run heavier loads, It's been a really long time since I've ran Amazon loads. And it's not that I don't like Amazon. I get better paying loads other places, and because I'm a live load to Amazon, I need to get loads that get me in and out quickly so I can book the next one. At Amazon, your load and unload, the loading's usually not bad when you're a live load because you're picking up at a vendor to Amazon. And so most of them are decent. Where you struggle is when you go to an Amazon facility and you have a 10 o'clock appointment and you sit in line to get to the gate for 2 hours. Then you're finally at the gate and they tell you your appointment's been canceled, or they don't have a door for you for another couple hours to go and get in line again. You know, I've had trucks sit at a location for 24 hours. And okay, yeah, they'll pay you detention up to 5 hours at $50 an hour, but that's $250 when the truck should be out moving another load making $1,000. And so that's part of why I made the move and run load board loads. I've got loads that pay way better. In some cases, yes, they're heavier, and yes, I'm burning more fuel, but the loads are paid well enough to offset that. I have at this point impressed a handful of brokers. Last week, they held a load for 2 days for me to come back into the area and pull a particular load for them at almost $5 a mile. Why? He likes the service. He likes the dependability. And so with Amazon, you're not going to get that. Amazon has orders to fill, and you're just a small piece to their puzzle. You're insignificant, and no one's going to wait for you or care about your revenue or your business. And I know now I'm going on a tangent about Amazon when the original idea was about the trucks. But anyway, so as we sit, I'm doing 70 miles an hour and I'm pulling about 1340 on the RPM. And this little motor, with the gear ratios and the settings, it averages overall just under 8 miles to the gallon. Now, on my heavier loads, that'll be less. On the lighter loads, it'll be more, but the overall average is there. It's a pretty fuel efficient setup. And that is one thing I gotta give to the Volvo engine. They are fuel efficient. And in the newest ones, I didn't really touch on the topic too much, but they're using a technology called turbo compounding, which basically means there's 2 turbos, but the second turbo isn't about generating more boost. The second turbo actually is connected to the gear set in the engine, and it transfers power directly to your flywheel. I know that sounds bizarre, but the second turbo puts power directly into the engine. It's not about making boosted air. And what that does is it allows you to run the engine at a much lower RPM. And so some of these guys are cruising down the highway doing 75 miles an hour, turning 1100 RPM, and those trucks are getting upwards of 9 miles to the gallon fully loaded. And so that's the future of the technology. I know Freightliner is doing something similar. I have heard there's been issues with them in the gear sets and stuff like that. I don't know specifics. I'm not directly familiar with them, but I do know there's been some issues. Once they get that figured out, the revenue difference, I should say the net difference of getting 9 miles to the gallon as compared to a hood truck doing 4 to 5 miles to the gallon, that's huge, especially in times like right now where you struggle to find fuel under $3 a gallon. That makes a big difference. You know, add that to an aero package that, you know, helps you cut the wind easier. You know, the Freightliner Evolution is crazy aerodynamic. I don't think all those plastic components will last long. I think within a couple years you're going to see, you know, bits and pieces of bumper missing and you know, all this other stuff. But the companies that are ordering them, that get rid of them in a couple years anyways, are obviously going to have the advantage of excellent fuel mileage. And that honestly is going to make it harder for companies like ours that are smaller and don't have that fuel advantage. It's going to make it harder for us to compete when the market starts to drop and the rates go down. Our fuel expense is in some cases double what the mega carriers are consuming. Plus, you know, they're getting a better discount, you know, because of the sheer volume they have. They're probably paying less for the fuel on top of the fact that they're burning less of it. And so this is kind of why I make fuel the focus of what I would pick. That's how and why we're competing with the mega carriers. Now again, if you're doing something specialized, you're doing, you know, a removable gooseneck, you're doing step deck, you're doing oversize, you know, the heavier loads require more power, more torque really is what we're talking about. And the easiest way to make up torque is mechanical leverage via gear ratios. And so to that end, those trucks, it makes sense to have a 377 or a 410 gear ratio and a 600 horse motor with an 18 speed. That makes perfect sense. You're going to be running over, you know, 120,000 pounds gross. That makes a lot of sense. When you're running Amazon loads, you're running 40 to 45,000 pounds gross. You don't need that much horsepower, you don't need that much torque, and you don't need that much gear ratio. Anyway, I've rambled on for a while. I just wanted to follow up a little bit because a couple of my buddies reached out and, you know, they almost sounded butthurt, and I'm like, damn it, bro, don't get all in your feelings. It's just some advice. Anyways, have a good morning, everyone. All right, guys, and so another thought with regards to how you want to spec your truck, you need to also kind of know what your focus is going to be. So let's say you decided you're going to do Amazon. You know, are you going to be like me and chase the bigger money on longer hauls? Or, you know, are you going to chase those work blocks for Solo One where, you know, they have you do 8 or 9 you know, dropping hooks? So engine aside, whether you get a large displacement, small displacement, big horsepower, low horsepower, the other way that gear ratios play into effect there is, what's your application going to be? And so when it comes time to spec a truck, you know, the question comes up, you know, what vocation are you in? Line haul, where, you know, a couple hours ago I put the truck in gear, took off, and since I've gotten on the highway, I haven't touched the clutch. I've made a couple shifts, but I haven't come to a complete stop where I'm engaging and disengaging the clutch, excuse me, from a dead stop. I idled the truck last night, and so my ECM is now requiring me or requesting me to do a part regen. And so when it goes into that mode, it takes a little power away. So instead of having the 505 horse on tap, right now it won't let me build more than 22 pounds of boost because it wants me to pull over and do the regen. And so I've had to do a little more shifting than I expected. You know, normally these little hills with this light of weight, there's no need to shift because the power gets you through. But more than just once you're running over the road, the other thing you have to consider is, are you going to be like me, put it in gear, and you're going to go 400 miles before you come to a dead stop again, and then you take off and you go another, whatever, 200 miles? Or are you going to be doing, you know, with Amazon, you get a lot of those local runs where you're doing drop and hook all day. So if you're going to do 6 or 7 drop and hooks, then a lower gear ratio is more appropriate because you're constantly engaging the clutch. And when you have a gear ratio that's too high, it's hard on the clutch, it's hard on your motor mounts, and it's hard on your driveline. And you can see this if you've ever watched trucks take off. You know, you can see the whole cab rocks back and forth. It almost looks like the driver doesn't know how to properly use the clutch. But a lot of times that's more, excuse my reach there, I had to turn the windshield wipers up. That's more based on the truck may not have the best gear ratios for the application. And so when I mentioned earlier that we spec'd a truck for my old employer and we put 377 gears in it, that wasn't just for more power. That was based on, you know, that truck was going to do pickup and deliveries, multiple in a day on construction sites, you know, in soft dirt, which puts more load on the drivetrain, and that makes your clutch last longer. So if you're wanting to do Amazon, and let's just say you're in the market where there's a lot of short haul stuff and you're going to be doing multiple drop and hook, then finding yourself a truck with lower gear ratios isn't a bad thing. And that again plays into the decision of what type of overall vehicle you're going to get. If you're going to do mostly drop and hook, you know, solo ones, and you occasionally do a solo two, you could get away with lower gear ratios and a smaller sleeper. The bigger sleeper in a hood truck, if you're going to do drop and hook daily, some of these locations aren't always easy to back up into, and the longer truck is going to make it more difficult. If you have the wrong gears, in other words, they're too high, you're going to be fighting that clutch because the truck's going to want to jump and lurch. And so, you know, that makes another difference. I mean, there's an immense amount of variables to this idea of how you want to spec a truck out. And so, you know, you'll notice when you go to some of these shippers, especially the bigger ones, the companies that are doing drop and hook and they show up, you know, they're bringing in an empty and they're pulling out a loaded, and it's probably just going a short distance. Those are typically day cabs because it's easier to blindside back, and they usually have lower gear ratios, and you'll notice those guys zip in and out in half the time it takes the rest of us. So if that's your idea, if that's your focus, you know, you're not planning on grabbing a load in Dallas, taking it to Phoenix, and then from Phoenix going to LA, and then grab a load from LA to Dallas, you know, and then, you know, that type of loops, If it's your idea that you're going to be local, let's say you work out of Dallas and you might go to Oklahoma, drop an empty, pick up a load and come back, the aerodynamics and the gear ratios aren't quite as critical. In fact, for something like that, you know, if you were to find an old FLD Classic, you know, the square-nosed ones with a Detroit 12.7, that would work fine, and you wouldn't see the big difference in the fuel mileage, because that difference doesn't come in stop and go traffic. Both trucks are going to consume a large amount of fuel when you're doing stop and go. The difference comes in when you get up, you know, to 70 miles an hour and you're going to sit there and ride 70 for 6 or 7 hours straight. That's where the difference comes in. You know, if you're going to go from, you know, let's just say Houston to Katy and do a drop and hook, and go to San Antonio, do another drop and hook, and then come back to Houston, the difference between a hood truck and an aerodynamic truck isn't as great. The difference between having 355 gears and 330 gears isn't as great. Those differences come in, you know, when you're going to rack up miles. I put this truck I'm driving now on the road. It had 796 on it. I want to say in May of last year, and she just today broke the 900 mark. So I've done well in excess of 100,000 miles in about 10 months. And so I'm working it, right? And most of my loads aren't 200 miles. Most of my loads are, my shorter loads are 400 miles. My longer loads are a couple thousand miles, just depending on what my goal is, right? For me, within Amazon, the sweet spot for the better pay when you provide your own trailer is between 300 and 500 miles. So a 500 mile load, better gear ratios and aerodynamics will definitely come into play. For your short haul stuff, where, you know, let's say you're in Phoenix and you're going to be bouncing back and forth between the Phoenix area, and maybe you go to Casa Grande or you go to Tucson, and that's your furthest drive, it's not quite as critical. You're not going to see the big difference. So at that point, you know, if your heart's set on a hood truck, you know, so be it. It won't make that big a difference. And if anything, like I say, if you're going to do a lot of stop and go, I would recommend slightly lower gear ratios. Your powertrain will thank you for it. Your motor mounts, clutch, driveline, it'll all be happier, because it puts a lot more torque on everything when you have a higher gear ratio. And so, like in my case, like I stated earlier, in my earlier clip, you saw and heard my clutch pedal squeaks. And so when you hear that little squeaky sound, that's me pushing the clutch in. And so I haven't touched the clutch since I jumped on the highway on that first clip. And I probably won't touch the clutch until I come to a complete stop somewhere, either to get fuel or take my half-hour break for lunch or whatever. The rest of the time I just float the gears. And so gear ratio gives you torque multiplication, but at the same time, the less torque multiplication you have, the more torque that forces against the engine and the rest of the powertrain. And by torque, I mean the twist and flex that's going to happen between your engine, the motor mounts, and the frame. And it's not just the engine. There's typically three motor mounts on the engine. There's typically something on the very front that the front case sits on, and then there's typically 2 side mounts on the block, and then your transmission will usually have another one, sometimes two. And so all of these things twist and flex when you let the clutch out, including your axles. If you have air ride suspension in particular, the axles kind of extend the suspension a little bit as the torque is applied. And so all of this motion does equate to wear and tear. And so if you're going to be doing city traffic, or like what's referred to as a city truck, city tractor, lower gear ratios are preferred. If you've ever jumped like a shuttle bus at an airport, you'll notice, especially if like it's excuse me, an E-Series van, like an E350 or whatever, you'll notice, it goes to take off and it shifts out of first gear like by 3 miles an hour, and then it shifts out of second gear by 15, and you're like, holy cow. They run really low gear ratios because they're going to do stop and go. The shuttle bus isn't going to jump on the highway and take you on a 50-mile trip. It's going to take you 1.5 miles from the parking lot to the terminal. And so that's a perfect example of fitting the right specification to your application. That vehicle is going to do stop and go, and that saves the transmission, it saves the rest of the powertrain. It even helps keep your coolant temperature under control. So anyways, just another afterthought. Holy cow, that's a rough bridge. But anyways, I'll probably have another thought afterwards and add another clip. Thanks, guys.